Chris from Masterpiece Bible positions himself as a thoughtful exegete, claiming to reveal the hidden moral signals in Genesis 19 about Lot and his daughters. But let's call this what it is, a sophisticated smokescreen for preserving patriarchal theology. His entire video is an exercise in selective moral framing, a sermon disguised as scholarship that shores up the Bible's most regressive gender politics while pretending to illuminate them. Here's the crux. Chris presents the story of Lot's daughters not as a trauma-fueled act of survival in a world abandoned by moral order, but as a cautionary tale about sinful women driven by lust and initiative. He insists the author of Genesis is quietly condemning them, not through direct judgment, but by layering literary clues, repetition of the word father, ironic narrative reversals, allusions to Ham and Canaan, and comparisons to Abraham's noble effort to find a wife for Isaac. But this method reveals more about Chris than it does about the biblical text. First, he assumes guilt and works backward. His interpretive lens begins with the presumption that female sexual agency, especially outside patriarchal control, is inherently suspect. So when Lot's daughters take initiative, even in a world where their survival options are razor-thin, it must be sin. He never once entertains the idea that the silence of God in the text might be indictment of Lot, or that the trauma these daughters endured, escaping fire and brimstone, watching their mother die, being offered to rapists by their own father, might justify desperate action. Second, Chris deploys literary parallels selectively and unevenly. He compares Lot's daughters to Ham, saying both exposed their father's nakedness, while praising Noah's other sons for covering their father like God did in Eden. But the metaphor falls apart on inspection. Ham merely seized Noah naked. Lot's daughters were raped by a drunk man they had to manipulate into unconsciousness just to conceive children. One is voyeurism, the other is reproductive survival in a post-apocalyptic vacuum. Lumping them together is moral gaslighting. Third, he invokes Genesis 24, contrasting Abraham's heroic efforts to find Isaac a wife with Lot's apparent failure to secure husbands for his daughters. But again, this reflects a modern Christian ethic projected backward. Lot just escaped a divine nuke on his city. Maybe organizing a wedding wasn't top priority. Chris doesn't explore whether the daughters had any say in marriage to begin with. Why? Because the daughters' lack of agency fits the biblical mold he's protecting. And finally, the kicker. Chris sets all of this up as a demonstration of God's disapproval. But God never appears in this story. The text is silent. That silence could just as easily be read as divine abandonment, or an invitation for the reader to wrestle with ambiguity. But Chris can't allow that. Ambiguity doesn't protect doctrine. So he retrofits the narrative with moral judgment the author didn't write and God didn't speak. In doing so, Chris unintentionally reveals the deeper issue. Biblical sexism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides behind literary analysis. Sometimes it slips past you when you're focused on structure, repetition, and intertextuality. But make no mistake, what's being defended here is a worldview where women's bodies are battlegrounds for male failure, divine silence, and theological control. Chris isn't just analyzing the Bible, he's disciplining its women. And his viewers, trusting his scholarly tone, absorb it like gospel. You want to expose biblical sexism? Start by exposing the interpreters who call their cage a masterpiece.